Please be seated. The court is now in session. Today, the chamber continues to hear the remainder of the testimony of expert Bạch Lavine and begins hearing testimony of a civil party, namely through TCCP 298. Ms. Sakalwati, please report the attendance of the parties and other individuals to today's proceedings. Greffier. Mr. President, for today's proceedings, all parties to this case are present, except Mr. Lee Sawana, the National Counsel for Nuon Chea, who is absent due to health reasons, and Bạch Ong, the National Lead Co-Lawyer, is absent for the first session this morning due to personal matters. Mr. Nuon Chea is present in the holding cell downstairs. He has waived his right to be present in the courtroom. The waiver has been delivered to the greffier. The expert who is to conclude her testimony today, that is Ms. Bạch Lavine, is present in the courtroom. The upcoming civil party, namely through TCCP 298, is ready to be called by the chamber. Thank you. President, thank you, Mr. Sakalwati. The chamber now decides on the request by Nuon Chea. The chamber has received a waiver from Nuon Chea dated 12 October 2016, which states that due to his health, that is headache, back pain, he cannot sit or concentrate for long, and in order to effectively participate in future hearings, he requests to waive his rights to be present at the 12 October 2016 hearing. Having seen the medical report of Nuon Chea by the duty doctor for the accused, the ECCC, dated 12 October 2016, which notes that today Nuon Chea has a lower back pain and feels dizzy when he sits for long, and recommends that the chamber shall grant him his request so that he can follow the proceedings remotely from the holding cell downstairs. Based on the above information and pursuant to Rule 81.5 of the ECCC internal rules, the chamber grants Nuon Chea his request to follow today's proceedings remotely from the holding cell downstairs via an audio-visual means. The chamber instructs the AV unit personnel to link the proceedings to the room downstairs so that Nuon Chea can follow. That applies for the whole day. The chamber now hands the floor to the elite co-lawyers for civil parties to put questions to the expert. Do you have the floor?
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning to all of you. Good morning to you, Ms. Expert. My name is Marie Guiraud, and I represent, together with Ang Pik, who is absent this morning, the Civil Party Collective in Case 002. And I have a certain number of questions, follow-up questions. A lot has already been said, of course, over the past 2 days. And I'm going to put to you a certain number of questions by quoting excerpts of your book, or excerpts from the transcripts that we received this morning. So simply just I would like to warn the interpreters that I'm going to quote in English because your book has not been translated yet. So if you have the impression that you have already answered these questions, of course, please tell us. And I now would like to give you an opportunity to maybe nuance some of the statements you made yesterday. So I would like to start with the first question regarding a term that you brought up quickly yesterday, which is a term that is central to your work, which is ritual side, the word ritual side. You said yesterday at 11:05, and I'm referring to the English transcript because these are the only transcripts we received this morning. You said, and I quote you, that you
traditional rituals
Had mapped the breakdown of traditional rituals
over time and the impact that had on an entire population. Pouvez-vous...
Can you explain, therefore, to the court what were the traditional rituals that were abolished during the decay regime? Of course, please say so in a synthetic way, because I don't have a lot of time. And then I'll put another question to you on the impact of this disappearance of the rituals on the population.
Thank you. Excuse me this morning. With regard to my study into the rituals, as was referenced, I believe, on the first day, I went for painstaking days upon days, went into very old texts, interviewed many people before 1970, so that I could be very clear about not just the rituals, but the sequence by which rituals happened, and what rituals were dropped out, what ritual objects were dropped out, what were added, what dynamics. There's a dynamic in rituals because there's often an exchange between people during the course of a ritual proceeding. So I looked at the rituals of weddings. I looked at the rituals of courtship. That was very important because that's an important sequence for the weddings. And I looked at the sequence of rituals for women from the time they are pregnant through to their delivery and post-delivery time. And in doing that, I was much more able to look at the breakdown of ritual than the breakdown of culture, because culture is so much more an amorphous entity to study. And what I found was that the sequence of rituals for people who were married, men and women, I looked at male and female rituals. Even during the birthing time, men had a role, whether it was finding the right fertile ground in which to bury the placenta. So it was very important for me to really pay attention to what were the roles and what were the interacting roles. And what I discovered, because it was a discovery for me, what I discovered was that there was a dramatic change in the ritual structure, in the access people had to rituals formally. Many sought rituals secretly, sometimes at the risk of feeling very afraid. And without rituals for protection, of course, that I was interested in what particular texture or kind of anxiety people experienced by not having a particular kind of protection that is embedded for centuries in Cambodia. I also looked at strategically the difference in rituals in terms of rituals that were happening in urban regions and rituals that were happening in remote regions, so I could get a sense of the ranked order of importance of rituals as well. And so that I was able to very strategically, when people were living in a countryside, excuse me again, I'm so sorry. It's so projected by this. When people were living in the countryside and they had been living in an urban region, what they didn't have access to, and similarly when they were being moved from one region to another with unfamiliar topography and geography, and even some nuanced differences in practices, what did that mean for them? That was probably my most profound finding in my study that I didn't set out to look for, and that I found to be most disturbing for my respondents. It oftentimes that was the focus when we spoke about weddings or births, what rituals they did not have access to, or what rituals they had to sneak, or their families had to sneak to find for them.
Thank you. And you drew a parallel yesterday, which you have just drawn right now, between the loss of rituals and the lack of protection. You say, or in your book, you speak about a Khmer word, Pekla, and you say how fear was a consequence of the loss of this loss of rituals and of this lack of protection. So can you provide us with more clarification on this concept? Is it a concept or is it a symptom? Is it something that you observed only among the sample you studied, or did you observe this at large when you spoke to different people? Because we learned through your statement that you consult, or through your patients in Takma as well in the United States. So what can you tell us about Pekla? Is it a symptom? Is it a feeling? Is it an emotion? And what was the impact on the population at large of this phenomenon?
I strategically chose the word dread for the title of my book because I think that word in many ways describes the experiences that people spoke about more than a clinical term, anxiety or post-trauma, because that term, almost in the French en parfait, it extends through time. And this, which I'm speaking to, that the Khmer word may not actually fully be able to realize, this concept of dread was haunting for people, so that everyone that I spoke to saw dead bodies, not that they said that they saw people being killed, but they saw dead bodies, whether it was holding a father who died of starvation or walking along a road and seeing some bodies floating. People saw dead bodies, and when they saw those dead bodies, yes, one would think that that's a traumatic experience, but for them to not have protection and to have the knowledge that the person who died, most likely those who died a violent death, what happens to the spirits of those who died? The unrest is profound. And so, yes, every single person I spoke with in my study, including those that I was interviewing as not part of my formal cohort, so that I could map the rituals, that was the purpose really in those interviews, spoke about a particular kind of dread on a daily basis.
Thank you. You also say on page 5 of your book, or you speak about the way the kinship links were modified during the decay period. And you say the following, and I'm going to read it out in English. I'll read out the short sentence.
Of family, friends, and neighbors became conditional rather than unconditional, and many became confused about loyalty and betrayal when separated from the familiar.
Can you therefore explain to the chamber in which way these links were altered during the DK regime, and what was the impact of this modification of the links, ties of trust, either in your sample or in the population at large?
Yes, this issue of trust is very complex. Suspicion, of course, was necessary in order to survive. But for example, if I can give you a sketch of the complexity of this, because it's not so simple that I don't trust my neighbor, they may dob me in. That's an Australian term, may submit my name for critique. I can think of, as an illustration, two young women walking out of Phnom Penh together, sisters. One is older, one is younger. The other is quite discerning and bright and realizes that it might be important to create a story about our past lives now as we're walking out of Phnom Penh. So for days, the older sister told a story of what their history is and had her sister rehearse and rehearse and rehearse that story. I suppose they did a good job because they held that story throughout the regime period. But the older sister had this fear, a bit of mistrust, not in her sister, but in her sister's developmental capacity to be able to hold and report that story without being tripped up. So I think that's an illustration of just how difficult this concept of suspicion is in that period, and that people became more and more observational, more and more at least in those that I spoke with, more and more heightened in their sensory awareness to be ready for anything that might be different, such as the pace of a footstep of someone walking towards someone. If that pace changed, people actually started to know when the pace could mean that they were going to be sent to hard labor by the person coming to them based on the pace. So everything was heightened. And I think that's really an important aspect.
And this suspicion that you describe, can we find it in the accounts of the people in your sample, or can you generalize and say that this suspicion existed more generally speaking throughout the country under the DK regime?
I can say that it increased dramatically, but also I want to add that other aspect that was introduced yesterday by the defense, and that is the concept of Ankar, because that creates yet a whole other cosmological dimension of suspicion and dread.
Well, I will turn to Ankar in the next two questions, but first I simply wanted to speak to you about the consequences of this loss of rituals on marriage in particular. And you said in your book at page 31, and I will quote once again in English,
my findings point to the omission of traditional ritual as a grave violation, and I claim that such omission is a crime against culture. Pouvez-vous?
Can you therefore explain to us what you mean by crime against culture? And can you tell the court if this crime against culture had an effect as well on the men and women who were married under the DK regime.
Because ritual is so much a foundation in a culture, microcultures as well as macrocultures, but I was looking at macro culture mostly here. The breakdown of that foundational ritual and the access to that at particular developmental stages in one's life, that's important too. Yes, I claimed that that is a crime against culture, but I think I need you to ask me the other part of your question.
And, well, did this crime against culture have a consequence or an effect on the men and women who got married under the DK regime?
Yes, and I'll explain a bit of my answer, because it's important for me to go back to courtship. Because the Khmer Rouge created a particular kind of courtship memento for people that was a microsecond in time. So traditionally, courtship, a long time ago, weddings would be arranged, and when the weddings were arranged, there would be a period of time, up to a year, where the couple would be able to spend time together, much more time together, be recognized by the community, and in that regard, the unfolding of recognition of someone, the unfolding of a story that one holds in a relationship moved forward as well, but also an evaluation period for parents on both sides, not usually the couple, but parents on both sides, as well as other community members. And I think that's a really important part, that the courtship and the weddings are not just about the nuclear family. And I was asked a question yesterday about a question I asked in my study about were the weddings real? And this might be a time for me to introduce my answer to that question, which I very much appreciated, because it brought me back into my fieldwork diary. So the question that was posed to me by the prosecution was, how was that term rendered, the term real? At least that was my understanding that was posed to me. So I went back, and the court can make a copy of this. I have the Khmer, and I have the 3 words that were referenced around real. Real meaning not fake, real meaning recognized, real meaning official. So it's this question that gave me the lens that allowed me to capture the within cultural view of the wedding. It also gave me some nuanced understanding of people's interpretations, or how they came to interpret the wedding as real. That's all I wanted to do, was to understand that. So I considered a statement when I went back into my research last night, and I have one here that I think represents what I'm trying to talk about here as the wedding was just not a nuclear family affair. I'm going to quote here. Yes, the wedding was recognized because the chief of the village and the chief of the commune and parents and brothers and sisters and aunties recognized us as a couple, even though they did not attend the wedding. As official couples, we could now live together. Now, I know that there's a lot in that quote, but the reason that quote was significant to me was, and to digress a moment, first the question was asked, was the wedding real? And the person said, well, yes, it was an official wedding. And my question after that was, please tell me about your answer. So I just want to let you know how I was able to solicit the response I just gave you. So that when we look at rituals and breakdown of rituals, it was important for me to create a sociogram of the space in which the rituals happened or didn't happen under DK. And that meant that I had to include players. Now what happened was some players were exchanged for other players that were usually in place traditionally. The question for me as a researcher was, did that shift in person in a particular role lead someone to believe something about the wedding they had? So again, a ritual involves more than just one person. It happens in a context.
Thank you. I am now going to transition to the role of Ankar in weddings, which you spoke about yesterday. You said, or you spoke about the quasi-mythological aspect of Ankar, or at least in the eyes of some people under the DK regime, and you said the following at 11:06. You said that certain people would give transformative powers to Ankar, that Ankar was completely unpredictable, and I will quote in English to make things easier.
So when someone was told that Ankar was asking them to be married, it was essential that they comply.
In your book, you speak at length about Ankar. And you associate the following terms to Ankar on page 13.
Fear, hypervigilance.
Can you therefore detail